We're Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We're launching the UK branch today, and we've got some absolutely amazing speakers. We've got some people from Belgium, we've got some people from Germany, we've got people all the way from America. So this is a global action. This is a point in the sand where we need a consensus. So I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, which is Neil Franklin, just to do a brief introduction on what LEAP is, and then we'll commence. Mr. Neil Franklin.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. And this is just a wonderful time in obviously the history of our organization, but I think it's going to just be a wonderful time in history as we hear from these experts that are going to address you today. So again, my name is Neil Franklin. Just real quick, I'm a retired major from the Maryland State Police in the United States, in the state of Maryland. And currently the Executive Director for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, known as LEAP. So I'm going to give a brief introduction regarding our organization for those of you who do not know who we are and what we are about. And I normally do not speak from notes, but today I am because I have been placed under strict time limits. So let us begin. February 29th. This is more than just the average LEAP day for a calendar. It is a great day, again, as I said before, for us, LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is an international not-for-profit organization of criminal justice professionals formed in 2002 by 5 police officers from Canada and the United States. LEAP's mission is to reduce crime, disease, death, and addiction by ending the most socially destructive public policy since slavery. That is the war on drugs, the prohibition of drugs. We go about our work by way of a constantly expanding Speakers Bureau, consisting of police officers, agents, judges, criminal prosecutors, corrections officials, and others. In 14 years, we have grown to more than 180,000 members and supporters spanning more than 80 countries around the globe. We have branches in the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Australia, Brazil, Costa Rica, and yes, the United States. Accredited as a United Nations NGO, LEAP is attempting to undo a set of prohibition-based international drug treaties that the United States is largely responsible for. Our members have been on the front lines of the world's longest war. We bear witness to the consequences of a policy that is counterproductive to public safety and community cohesiveness. For over 5 decades, we have been attempting, and when I say we, I mean around the globe, we have been attempting to solve a public health crisis with criminal justice solutions, and the results are catastrophic. Over the next few minutes, you will hear in more detail the reasons for this necessary, and I say necessary, drug policy reform. Thank you.
We're going to have a quick video message so we can turn the projection off. So if you can just excuse me just for one moment. I hope the sound works, and if we... It's the Johanna relay. There's no sound. Anybody got a technical expert? We're going to put this online anyway, but this is Richard Branson giving us his support on LEAP Day. There is no. No, this is saying it's working down here, but we'll thank Mr. Richard Branson for that. We got the. This will be played at Waterstones tonight, because we've got an event at Waterstones tonight at 7 o'clock where we're going to do more of an informal position where we can showcase some of our own footage as well, which Mr. Sam Steele over here has kindly been donating to us. So we're going to have more of an interactive feel at Waterstones tonight to get some communal voices and Richard Branson will be featured there, and he will be on our website later at ukleap.org. So please do view this because we're so grateful. So we'll turn this off. Or I'll just hold it. So now we're going to get European Director of LEAP, which is Miss Annie Michon, who was a former MI5 officer. And Annie Michon.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Jason, and I'm thrilled to be here for the launch of LEAP UK. I first came to the knowledge that the war on drugs was an abject failure when I was working as an intelligence officer in MI5 in the mid-1990s. One of my postings was to investigate terrorist logistics, and to do this I worked very closely with Customs and Excise as well, both the National Investigations Division and the courts. During that time I learned from them that they viewed even then that the war on drugs was unwinnable, and I also learned very clearly a massive overlap of funding between the illegal drug trade and also terrorist organisations. And this is global, not just in Northern Ireland in the 1990s. We see this time and time again in Afghanistan, as we will hear next, in some of the Latin American countries where terrorist organisations like FARC have been largely funded by the drug money. And of course now we've seen most of Northwest Africa descend into a sort of narco state where armed militias compete for the drug territory. So on one hand we have prohibition that pushes the war on drugs underground, and that creates huge profits globally and annually. And on the other hand, and then we fight the war on drugs, and then on the other hand we are fighting the war against terror, which is being funded largely by this war on drugs. So it strikes me as illogical, unless it's a very clever circular business model that has been only too successful. And we know this is going on because bank after bank globally has been fined in record numbers for being caught out on money laundering. So we have a number of banks have been convicted of this. And in fact, we know from 2009 the sheer scale of this corruption of our banking industry as well. Because in 2009, a man called Antonio Maria Costa, who was then head of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, went on the record and said, after the financial crash of 2008, but for drug money, many large international banks would not have had any cash liquidity. This shows the scale of the problem. So, by ensuring that prohibition ends, we will also be able to end the biggest crime rate our world has ever seen. We will be able to protect millions, if not billions, of people around the planet who have been ravaged, not only by the drug war crimes and the vicious violence, but also from the terrorist groups who are funded largely by this trade and who continue to maim and kill around the planet too. So I very much support this initiative to end prohibition, to make all of us around the planet much safer. Thank you very much.
So what we're going to do is we're going to draw a map of what prohibition is. We're going to see how it starts, as Annie said, from the conceptual war all the way down to the streets of the inner city. But before we get there, Mr. Norman Lamb MP has come along to support us today and wants to say a few words, and it's got to go pretty quickly after this. So Mr. Norman Lamb.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And I'm a Liberal Democrat MP. I was a minister, a health minister in the coalition government, responsible, amongst other things, for mental health. And I have an acute interest in trying to achieve equality for those people who suffer from mental ill health. And one thing that I don't think is particularly helpful is to prosecute people who end up sometimes using drugs because of their mental ill health. It seems to be a spectacularly stupid public policy. But I guess overall, I should also incidentally say that at our spring conference, I will be presenting a motion to the Liberal Democrat Conference calling for our party to support and call for a regulated market in cannabis. It's now happened in several American states. Canada appears next to follow suit under the new Liberal government there. And things are starting, I think, to change internationally. And I think it's long overdue to call time on the most discredited public policy, and that is the war on drugs. Started, incidentally, by the most discredited of US presidents, Richard Nixon. it has been spectacular in its failure. We have managed to provide every year a multi-billion-dollar industry straight into organised crime internationally, and indeed fueling terrorist networks. We manage at the same time to criminalise very many, particularly of our younger people, blighting their career prospects, doing something that only affects themselves, not others in society, and yet we choose to criminalise them, whilst at the same time remember that probably something like 50% of our current government have taken drugs in their time, but happen to have got away with it, so haven't had their careers blighted. But then they maintain the argument that we should continue to prosecute people. It seems to be the height of hypocrisy, and one that should be exposed at every opportunity. For me, this should be a health issue. I absolutely recognise that there are dangers with some drugs, and there are dangers with the excessive use of drugs, whether they are currently legal or illegal. But that should be the approach that we take, not using the criminal law to seek to enforce it. The Home Office study, which the Lib Dems initiated in government, demonstrated that there is no link between the toughness of your approach to drugs in any particular country and the usage of drugs. So it's a pointless exercise anyway. And at the same time, if I was choosing to use an illicit drug, I suspect that most criminals selling me the drug don't have much interest in my welfare. I would prefer to buy in a regulated market where I had some idea what I was buying. So for all these reasons, it is time to change our approach. I think actually most of the public are ahead of politicians on this. The politicians are stuck here in a time warp, petrified to do anything. We had a debate recently where we had a wonderful coalition between Paul Flynn from Labour, me from the Lib Dems, Caroline Lucas from the Greens, and Peter Lilly from the Tories. It was four of us speaking up for the case for reform. But the case is long overdue, and I really, really welcome, this is the final thing I would say, I welcome the arrival of LEAP in the UK, because for people involved in law enforcement to make the case is actually far more powerful than politicians making the case. You've seen it. You know the ridiculous consequences of this outrageous war on drugs. You know about the millions of people across the world, both prosecuted and convicted, but also who've lost their lives in places like Mexico, where you see gang warfare, beheadings, and the whole array of awful consequences of this ridiculous, futile war on drugs. So let's just end it now and adopt a more rational approach. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Norman Lamb, and we do need to thank Paul Flynn today for sponsoring this room and for his years of championing evidence-based drug policy. So we're going to start on our roadmap. We're going to do the roadmap of prohibition, starting with the Afghan poppy field, where Patrick Hennessy served as a Grenadier Guard officer in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and is now a practicing barrister, and quite frankly is a brilliant speaker.
A kiss of death, isn't it? I was going to say, the problem is, I've been an army officer and then a barrister. In my last job, I could force you to do press-ups if you weren't paying attention. And in my current job, I get paid by 6-minute chunks for speaking, so the prospects of it being interesting or brief are fairly slim. But I feel kind of out of my depth on this panel as well, actually. You're going to hear from far more expert people than I am, and genuine professionals. I was a soldier for 5 years and had an interesting time, and my experience is very anecdotal. But I was thinking when Neil was giving the introduction that actually I guess one of the places I do come from, or one perspective I do have, is that I fought a kind of old-fashioned war, the ones with kind of planes and bombs and bayonets, not that those aren't a feature of the so-called war on drugs in other parts of the world. And it's one of those things that you come across so often in this debate that is so blindingly obvious. You kind of have to question that there are grown-up people with important jobs who don't see this themselves. But you can't fight a war on a thing. And as someone who has fought 2 or 3 wars against kind of people and states, I would just say that you can't fight a war against a thing, and that goes for other wars as well. But so the kind of idiocy of the war on drugs, and it's almost if you were asked to write a kind of little gobbet to sort of show how illogical and how sort of illiterate the whole thing was. You pick Helmand, where more than 400 British servicemen, countless hundreds of Afghan civilians and servicemen who are all too often forgotten when we talk about this, hundreds of Americans, Canadians and French soldiers, Estonians, Danes among others, all lost their lives in Helmand, which produces nearly half or more than half, depending on whether it's a good crop in other parts of the country, about half of Afghanistan's opium production. And you will have seen, or some of you will have seen in the news in the last couple of weeks, maybe not because now our boys aren't there, it's not news anymore, but Sangin and Musa Qala in northern Helmand are now kind of pretty much back in Taliban control. And I put a sort of stress on Taliban because what we didn't understand in the army when I was there, what we don't seem to have understood for most of the time we were spending billions of pounds and losing people there, but what is certainly the case is that the people we were fighting, people I was fighting in Helmand, were probably not Taliban in the sense of signed up, Quetta Shura, come over the border from Pakistan, want to create a new government in Kabul. And Sangin is just a crazy brilliant example of this. The last bit of Sangin, as we speak, which is under government of Afghanistan control, if there is such a thing, both control and the government of Afghanistan. The last bit of Sangin is what was known as Forward Operating Base Jackson, for the hundreds of British and American service personnel who went there. It's now known as the Sangin District Centre. And it was the first building that the Paras kind of bought, negotiated their way into in 2006. It became sort of headquarters for British operations. It was one of the houses of a guy called Lao Jang, who was a prominent operator from the Ishkazi tribe in Helmand, who, before the British arrived in Sangin, controlled the Sangin Bazaar, where they levied a tax on most of the opium going through. It's the most lucrative thing going. They weren't around when the British came in. So this building, which is now the Sangin DC, was sold to the British by, not the owner, but the owner's rival tribe's elder, who obviously saw a great way of getting his rival out. So, yeah, here you go, have this house. Took a couple of $1,000s for a house that wasn't his. And the British, and then the Americans, and now the Afghan security forces have been there ever since. And the majority of fighting they have done over 8 years, 106 British servicemen, about 100 Americans in Sangin alone, the majority of the fighting has been against members of this tribe from the guy who wants his house back and wants control of the market where he can levy the tax on opium back. And it's just staggering to think that is what it comes down to. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan. I've been a few times, I've written a few books, but the guys who do know what they're talking about, Mike Martin's book, An Intimate War, is a war that anybody should read if you want to stand the opium trade in Helmand. And he's quite clear, and most people know more than I do, quite clear, the Helmand economy is the opium economy. So when I was there and we weren't being shot at too much, it was because despite what we were being told further up the chain, we weren't so stupid as to not be going into every village and saying, we are not going to touch your property. And arguably the upturn in violence against coalition forces came in 2009, 2010, when with the investment of the American Marine Brigade, they started saying, hang on, Mark, we're supposed to be eradicating poverty as well. It's not a strategic consideration, but let's do that. And funnily enough, everybody whose livelihood was going up in smoke started planting IEDs. So if you want a starting point of how illogical, illiterate this whole process is, do it there. And I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious that other people will probably cover this, but I wanted to finish with one more little example, which I think shows the sort of bizarreness and stupidity of this whole thing. So obviously I came back from the first time I was in Afghanistan in 2008, and one of the last and really kind of depressing things I had to do after I decided I was leaving the army, sort of administrative task, was I had to kick out one of my best soldiers. He was a 21-year-old Lance Corporal who had failed a compulsory drugs test in the army because he'd taken a pill at a festival, having come back from 7 months in Afghanistan, where he put sort of 7 of his best mates in a box. And he failed the drugs test about 2 weeks later, and because of the Army's compulsory drug testing zero tolerance policy, he had to be kicked out. Now, one can debate the rights and wrongs of that. The guy that signed his final discharge paper was my boss. He was also an absolutely brilliant soldier, and this is nothing against his professional ability. He'd had a 6-month rap on the knuckles earlier that year because of his drink driving conviction. Now, I went back to check the statistics, and in 2008, 15 people died from MDMA-related deaths, which, I mean, goodness knows what that actually means, dehydration, other substances, etc. 1,350 serious life-changing injuries as a result of drink driving incidents, 350 fatalities, which is almost as many guys as we lost in Helmand over 14 years. So, drink driving conviction, rap on the knuckles, 6 months. Oh, can you sign the papers of the guy? 1 pill at a festival, and 4 for 7 months in Afghanistan and out of the army. So, another good example of why this doesn't work.
And Patrick's an author of the Junior Officers Reading Club, which I've actually got on my desk at the moment. And speaking of authors, Johan Hari, who is, I think, personally one of the most life-changing bits of literature I've read on the war on drugs. And Chasing the Scream, the first and the last days of the war on drugs. Johan Hari.
Oh, thanks very much. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then. I was quite small, but as I got older I realised we had drug addiction in my family. And I wanted to understand what would genuinely solve the problems that we associate with drugs. So I went to 15 different countries. I went to the places where they have the most brutal possible policies towards drug users and drug dealers. I went out with a chain gang of women in Arizona who were made to wear t-shirts saying I was a drug addict. And I went to the places that have the most compassionate approaches to drug users and the most regulated approaches to the drug trade to try to understand the differences. And one of the things that most struck me is there is nowhere I met anyone more articulate and with a more concise and important vision of how to solve these problems than law enforcement against prohibition. And Georg in Germany, the team in the United States, do incredibly important work. I just want to talk about 2 ways in which this affects us here in Britain that I think are really important. We're seeing a lot of actually uptick in drug war-related violence. We've got shootings in Salford, actually a stepping up of the drug war. You've now got drug dealers shooting each other's children, which has never happened before in Britain. Huge number of stabbings here in London between rival drug gangs. It's really important to understand why this is happening. If you want to understand it, there's a little experiment that you can do. Go out of here, go to the nearest, I know there's a bar that we all subsidise, go to the nearest bar and try to steal a bottle of vodka. If they catch you, they'll ring the police, and the police will come and take you away. So that bar doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. They have the power of the law to uphold their property rights. Okay, you can try that. Then go and try to steal a bag of cannabis, or a bag of cocaine, and I'm sure there are places, even in the House of Commons, where you can do that, right? If that guy catches you, the guy who sells that, he can't ring the police would come and arrest him. He has to fight you. Now, if you're a drug dealer, you don't want to be having a fight every day. You've got to establish a reputation for being such a badass, for being so frightening that no one would dare to take you on. You establish your place in the community by fighting other people, and you maintain your place in that trade by fighting other people. As one American writer put it, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs that does not otherwise exist. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, calculated there are 10,000 additional murders every year in the United States as a direct result of that dynamic. More people have died in Mexico and Colombia than have died in Syria as a direct result of that dynamic. And it has nothing to do with the drug itself. If we banned milk and people still wanted to buy milk, it would be provided in a prohibited market that would have to operate through violence. And there's nothing abstract about that. There's a very simple historical experiment that's been done. Ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers today? Does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Guinness in the face? Do the guys who work at Oddbins go and stab the people who work in the drink aisle at Asda? No. Exactly that happened under Prohibition. The exact thing. We all know who Al Capone was. We all know about the St. Valentine's Day massacre. And what happened to that violence? The day alcohol prohibition ended, the very day it ended, that violence ended. Jeffrey Myron, a professor at Harvard, has done a graph of the murder rate in the United States. Massively spikes up during alcohol prohibition, spikes down the day alcohol prohibition ends, and when does it spike up again? When they intensified drug prohibition in the 1970s. It's not the only factor, but it's a huge factor. And again, we can go and look at the results. Switzerland, just over a decade ago, legalised heroin for addicts. Ruth Dreyfus, the president, extraordinary visionary person, first female president, first Jewish president, amazing woman. She explained to people, When you hear us talk about legalisation, what you picture is anarchy. What we have now is anarchy. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown chaotic drug users, all in the dark. Legalisation is the way we restore order to this system of anarchy. They legalised heroin for addicts. Doesn't mean you can just go into the equivalent of Boots and buy heroin. I went to the clinics where they're given to addicts. You have to use it there, you can't take it out with you. The addicts then leave and go to their job. They almost all get jobs because they're given, the chaos of being a street user ends. They're given support to turn their lives around. Almost all of them voluntarily come off the program because they cut down their drug use over time. Do you know how many people have died of heroin overdoses on legal heroin in Switzerland? Nobody, not a single person. Do you know how many violent heroin dealers there are in Switzerland? None. They don't exist. Do you know how many Swiss people? Switzerland is a really conservative country. My dad's from there, so I'm a citizen there as well as I'm here. My grandmother got the vote in 1973, right? This is not San Francisco. Do you know how many Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal once they'd seen it in practice? 70%. One of the things I most learned is, with reforming the war on drugs, it is super controversial. Before you do it, the politicians who propose it are regarded as a bit mental. And then it happens. And then it happens, and it's not a magic bullet. There are still tragedies, but there's such a significant improvement. I want to give you one more example very quickly. Portugal, in the year 2000, had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. And every year they tried the war on drugs more. They arrested and they imprisoned more people, and every year the problem got worse. And one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together, and they basically said, we can't go on like this, we can't have ever more people becoming heroin addicts, what are we going to do? And they decided to set up a panel of scientists and doctors, led by an amazing man called Dr. João Goulart. And they said to them, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So it just took it out of ordinary party politics. So they went away, and I don't think they thought they'd recommend this, but they came back and they looked at all the best evidence about how to reduce addiction, and they came back and said, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack, but, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently burn and waste on all the stuff that you guys are talking about, and spend it instead on turning addicts' lives around. And what's interesting about that, it's not really what we think of as drug treatment. They did fund rehab, they did fund some psychological support, that does have some value. Biggest thing they did was a massive program of job creation for addicts. Say you used to be a mechanic, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, give this guy a job for a year, we'll pay half his wages. What they wanted to say to every addict in Portugal was, we love you, we value you, you deserve to have a good life just like everyone else, and we want you back. And it's now been 15 years in Portugal, and the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Didn't happen next door in Spain where they didn't do this. Overdose deaths are massively down. HIV transmission is massively down, which, as you guys know, saves the money straight off the bat anyway, because it's so expensive once people become HIV positive to treat them. I went and interviewed João Figueira, who was at the time the top drug cop in Portugal. And he led the opposition to the decriminalisation when it happened. He said what I know a lot of people are going to get people saying to you the whole time, surely if we decriminalise all drugs, we'll have all sorts of catastrophes, we'll have a huge explosion in drug use. He said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he told me he felt really ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users before the decriminalisation, and he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example. Just as a last thought, I've spoken to politicians all over the world who led alternatives to the war on drugs, and they all said one thing: it was really hard, it was really tough, and it was the proudest thing they ever did. It's quite rare in politics you get the chance to, with a relatively simple reform, save the lives of tens of thousands of people. That is in your power. You can do that. You will be so proud of yourself if you do it. Thank you very much.
With him in my pocket, I wouldn't need to speak anymore.
Sorry. Also Google Johan because his TED Talk's had over 4 million views I think it is now. And his animated short which he wrote, which is Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong, has had over 5 million, and it's convincing, it really is. So now we move on to the barriers of recovery, and Suzanne Sharkey is one of our newest lead speakers, and along with her partner Fiona Gilbertson run Recovery and Justice, which discusses what Suzanne does.
Welcome. So thank you, Jason, for asking me to speak here. When I sort of went, well, what am I supposed to say? He said, oh, unique selling points. And I was like, I'm not sure about that. So I'll start off. My name is Suzanne Sharkey. I'm an ex-police officer from Northumbria Police, right up north. And I ended up in the crime team, CID, and I did undercover drugs buying. I'm also in long-term recovery, but I don't see myself as someone that's special, different, or unique. Everyone in this room will know somebody who's either affected by substance misuse or someone who's in recovery. You might not know that fact, but you will know somebody. And behind that are stories of pain and suffering. And like I said, I'm in long-term recovery from problematic substance misuse. And I say problematic, but I had catastrophic consequences to my using. I was arrested multiple times, got a criminal record, admitted to hospital even more times, and I ended up homeless. But I'm one of the lucky ones. 7.5 years ago, I woke up in hospital again, attached to tubes and monitors again. And I didn't really quite believe I wasn't dead, because that was the plan. And I decided to live that time. And what happened and what made me change my mind. It wasn't the police cells and the court appearances that helped. It wasn't the stigmatisation and marginalisation that I got from society. Being made to feel like I was some depraved person lacking moral fibre. Or worse of the worst, as a mother who couldn't stop using for her children. It was the people, I might get emotional here, the people that I'd seen in recovery who tried to help me. They were there by my bed when I woke up in hospital, and no matter what I did, they continued to support me. They showed me recovery was possible, you could do it. And they nurtured me and loved me until I could do it myself. Don't cry now. Dad. So, like I said, they nurtured me and they loved me. And I could do it myself. And let's be honest, when I'd woken up in a police cell again, I didn't quite feel the same love there. What I did feel was guilt, shame, remorse, and a failure again. And as I reflect back on my time in the police, I always feel ashamed. I feel a sense of failure. I feel ashamed that I wasn't arresting career criminals. I was arresting people from poor, socially deprived areas with little or no hope, whose crime was non-violent drug possession. The complete failure of this so-called war on drugs. And I believe that one of the biggest barriers to people with problematic substance misuse and seeking help, treatment, is the current drug policies. It does nothing, achieves nothing, except creating more harm for individuals, families, and society as a whole. All of us in this room know the problems and what we need to do, but rather than be united in here by the problems, let's be united by the solutions. Solutions based in health, education, and compassion, rather than criminalisation. I'll leave it there.
That just about says it all. And from there, from the barriers to recovery and what it does, we go to community policing and how that affects society. Paul Whitehouse was Chief Constable for 8 years of Sussex and has 32 years of policing experience.
Thanks, Jason. And like Suzanne, I started not quite in Northumbria, but in Durham, and I served for quite a long time in Northumbria. But my experience in Durham was significant because I was the first member of the Durham Constabulary Drug Squad. I was put into a task, a group of people charged with detecting offenders who were committing offences which the previous year had not existed. What they were doing was suddenly illegal. How do you maintain faith with the community when you're saying, no, you can't do that? 32 years in the police service made me absolutely clear that the policy you adopt, whether you're in the House of Commons, in government, whether you're running a police force or anything else, whether you're running a company, should depend on the evidence available to you. All of the successful companies, and we saw Richard Branson earlier, get the metrics, they show what works and they show what fails. They don't do things that fail because they worked out the evidence points in the other direction. And we've heard about the evidence of prohibition from Johan and from earlier speakers. Prohibition has failed in alcohol, and because it failed in alcohol, it's not going to work in drugs. It cannot possibly work while we continue to spend money on criminalising people who are doing probably less harm to themselves than some of the people who go binge drinking. Or I think it was 7 men thrown off the Ryanair flight coming back from a stag weekend in Eastern Europe at Berlin over the weekend. That's condoned, just like the drink driving senior officer. One of my abiding memories of a politician for whom I don't have a great deal of political comment, a chap called Michael Howard, was when he was Home Secretary and I was a Chief Constable, and we were invited to a lunch in London to celebrate, I think it was a 10-year anniversary of an organisation called Addaction. And there was a fairly big table of the great and the good. You can visualise the sort of thing, and there were some speeches. He was the guest of honour because he was Home Secretary, and I was there representing the police service. We were the only 2 people around the table who did not drink alcohol. And I remarked on that when I spoke, which was after him, and he came back and said, thank you. I hadn't wanted to say it, but I endorsed that point. How can we say that alcohol, which causes untold harm, enormous amount of harm, we've heard about drink driving. Look at domestic violence. Look at the children of domestically violent households, etc. If we think alcohol is that bad, why don't we ban it? Because it won't work, and we should take the same view on drugs. Thank you.
So we're going to enforce the international point, and Hubert Wimber is here from Germany, where they launched Leap Germany in the Bundestag. Hubert Wimber was Chief of Police.
Thank you, Jason, for this friendly introduction. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to be here to congratulate you from Leap Germany for the cause of launching Leap UK. And what's an honor for me to speak to you in this impressive and history-charged rooms. In fact, it was never on my scheme of life to deliver a speech in the British Houses of Parliament. I'm glad to be here and hope that my visit is the beginning of a good connection and a cross-border cooperation between Leap UK and our organization in the Federal Republic, which I think is very important to obtain our goals. On your speakers list, I found my name under the chapter Community and Policing. I want to say some words to this, but I want to give you also, in a second step, a short impression of the current debate in Germany. Since the beginning of this century, we have a good and very trustful cooperation between the community in Münster, the city where I come from, and the police. It depends on the fact that we established together in 2002 the first drug consumption room in our city, the first drug consumption room in North Rhine-Westphalia and the second in Germany, where especially heroin users can shoot up under good hygienic conditions and with the opportunity of medical attendance. By the way, at that time, against the resistance of the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime in Vienna. Since that time, we have no disorder problem in the public area of Münster caused by drug consumers. For example, 120,000 used needles of consumers are exchanged in the consumption room per year, which you found before in the public parks and up the children's playgrounds in the city. This was a real disorder problem with a lot of affliction which touched down on my desk. Today, the drug consumption rooms are a successful model for harm reduction in many places in Germany. But, much to my regret, not so in Bavaria, which is a very curious part of the Federal Republic. Some impressions about the current debate about drug policy in Germany. According to a recent representative poll by a well-known German agency, 42% of those questioned agreed with the statement that cannabis should be made legal and regularly available for adults. Towards the end of the year, the number of the people in favor of legalization has gone up with 12%. And a small majority of 51% of Germans believe that cannabis will be legally available for adults in a few years. This notable increase of people in favor of legalization is the outcome of a political debate on drugs that has gained in Germany during the last years. The vast majority of people and institutions with a professional relation to addiction problems come to the conclusion that a drug policy which focuses essentially on punishment and penal prosecution is not leading to avoid and reduce harms caused by drug consumption. Far from it, the drug laws with the sanctions themselves cause direct harm to drug consumers. And I think police must become a part in this debate. The professional analytic expertise of policemen, prosecutors, and so on, organized in LEAP, is important and necessary. But there's more to do it than that. We must put straight that the police overall is not anymore interested in positions of faith, opinions, and commonplaces about prohibition, but what we expect is clear evidence. The police and other organizations of law enforcement invest a considerable range of human and material capabilities to fight against drugs. In Germany in 2014, the police in total notices about 276,000 penal offenses concerned drug criminality. This represents a percentage of around about 5% of all offenses that were investigated by the police. The quantity of these criminal offenses increases in the last 10 years, and this increase is based exclusively on the increase of so-called consumption-related offenses like possession and purchase for personal use, which represents about 75% of all cases of drug criminality. But I ask you, dear colleagues, for what? About 210,000 cases of penal prosecution against consumers who do not have victims and harm nobody, besides maybe in some cases themselves, which is in our legal order not punishable. Let's try together to finish this nonsense. Thank you very much for your time.
So now we're going to speak to Jim Duffy, who is up in Scotland, along with our fantastic coordinator, Carol Hughes here, who...
That's all true.
Jim was head of Strathclyde Police Federation and was a police inspector.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Prohibition has been an out-and-out failure. Hasn't worked anywhere in the world, anywhere at all. I joined the police in 1975. 1975, we talked about a tenner bag. I left 32 years later. We still talk tenner bags. If inflation had kept pace with it, it would have been £147. That didn't happen. So prohibition doesn't work, and the reason I know it doesn't work, for absolute certain, is that if you had a drug-free street or town or village anywhere in your country, you wouldn't be able to get near it for politicians, because they would always be standing there saying, look what we've done. And that is currently the shortest queue on the planet. It doesn't work for lots and lots of reasons. In Scotland in particular, we have 350,000 casual cannabis users. If we put them into a vote in Parliament, we would get about 9 or 10 seats. We don't get that. We have 55,000 heroin addicts. We lock them up. We put them in jail, where it costs us nearly £1,000 a week to keep them there. It's almost as bad as they are in America, where between 1971 and 2007, they put 39 million people in jail for non-violent drug offences. Prohibition doesn't work. There is a demand for it, and simply saying no doesn't stop that demand. The thing you have to remember about your drug dealers are they are the people who decide what drugs they will give away or sell to your children and your grandchildren. They are the people who will decide what it's cut with, what the purity will be, what the strength will be, what the effect will be. They don't ask for ID. They will sell it to whoever has the money. That's a shameful situation, and we have allowed that to continue for the last 45 years by the continued prosecution of the Misuse of Drugs Act and the idea that prohibition will make a difference. It has not, and it will not, and we need to change that. If we don't change that, and you're quite happy to sit on your hands, we'll be having this debate in 10, 12, 15 years' time. And in that time, the number of people who die as a result of the misuse of drugs will increase. It's a public safety issue. The government are always telling us, the use of drugs in this country is going down, and it's going down marginally, to the extent that in the next 70 years, it will be back at where the 1970 levels were. I don't have 70 years to wait. It needs to be addressed now. And it's a real public health issue for a number of reasons. In my home country of Scotland, we have a terrific Scotch whisky industry. It's supported by the government, it's publicised, it's legalised, it's regulated, they make obscene amounts of tax that come to this place. And 7,000 people a year die from alcohol in Scotland. We have a tobacco industry in Scotland, which employs lots of people and again raises a great deal of tax. And we have 13,000 deaths every year in Scotland from tobacco. From all of my investigations, I cannot find a single recorded death from cannabis anywhere in the UK. Now, I might not be the brain of Britain, but even I can work out that I think we're targeting the wrong things. But as previously been said, we wouldn't ban alcohol because it doesn't work. We like a drink. We wouldn't ban tobacco because the lepers at the gate outside like a smoke. We wouldn't ban gambling because people like a wee bet. All things in moderation. So why do we think that by banning drugs through prohibition we can stop this? We can't. We need to change that. People need to talk about it. It needs to be talked about from grassroots right up to the politicians in this place and other places who have the ability and the powers to change things. They need to start putting their head above the parapet. Thank you very much.
Jim said, we do need to talk about this, and we're not going to rest on our laurels. The whole point of what we're doing is to get out into outreach and grassroots and promote the voice of the people you're hearing. And we're doing that through a campaign called Do Ask, Do Tell, where we're going to put this online. I'm going to have all the voices here collected by our video guy over here, Sam, and we're going to put it online. So next we're going to speak from people that are still on the front line and doing something about drug law reform as we speak, in Ron Hogg and Mike Barton over here, who are PCC and Chief Constable of Durham respectively. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. I suspect Mike won't, because we're not licensed for that. I'm hoping that today really indicates a new shift in the debate around drugs and where we stand on drugs. And perhaps, there is a narrative there which is showing that there's a new scenario unfolding. We're hearing from David Cameron more noises about problem-solving courts, Jeremy Corbyn talking about looking at drug law reform, and again, we know the position of our Liberal Democrat and Green Party friends. We've also got former Chief Constables here, serving Chief Constables from other countries, and indeed Mike Barton, my own Chief Constable. And did I point out that Durham Constabulary is the best police force in England and Wales? That's quite official. I had to get that in because there are people here who can vote for me on the debate. One of the things about Mike is that he always displays leadership, and that leadership came to the fore when one Sunday he was travelling incognito to Cardiff, and there was an article published in the Observer saying the war on drugs has failed. Nobody could get a hold of Mike, so my home was invaded by the media from across the whole of the UK. But we are very clear in our view in Durham Constabulary that war has failed. It was never likely to succeed, and it never will succeed. And what we have to do is we have to change our views. We have to change the way in which we approach things. The whole purpose of any drugs policy must be to minimise the harm that those drugs cause to individuals, to our communities. It must be to optimise the benefits that drugs can bring. And I've discussed with people like Paul Flynn in here today about the legalisation of cannabis for medicinal purposes, for instance. So these are the things that we must be looking at. We must be looking at building on this evidence-based approach that sending people to prison to recover from drugs actually does not work. In fact, they get into worse situations there. There's all sorts of stuff such as spice in our prisons now, which actually are causing much more harm to the individuals, and they're coming out much more damaged. But we must make sure that we're focusing on both illegal and legal drugs, such as Jim has just pointed out. And let's look at what the government, the UK government, was consulting on last year when they were talking about reforming the policing formula for forces across England and Wales. It identified 6 drivers of crime and demand upon police services. One of them was alcohol. And they reckon the cost to alcohol to our criminal justice services, hospitals, etc., was £11 billion per annum. So again, it supports the views that others have stressed here. Look at drugs. The paper that they produced stated, this is their statistics, not mine, heroin and crack cocaine addiction responsible for 43% of acquisitive crime. Responsible for 33% of fraud as people commit crimes to actually feed their habits. But this appears to be, to many, a satisfactory situation, and will just allow this to continue and go forward. Well, we don't think that that's the way that things should be going forward, and that's why we've taken our stand in Durham, and we've put our heads above the parapet in other ways to introduce new ways of tackling drug and alcohol addiction. I was in the Market Square in Durham on Saturday morning trying to promote my chances in the election on the 5th of May, for those of you who are from County Durham and Derby who can vote for me. When someone approached me and says, I know you, he says, you're the man who decriminalised cannabis in Durham. I said, well, can't really do that, but what we're focusing on is saying we don't want to bother about the users. He was using it for medicinal purposes. I'm not really interested in you. We'll focus on the dealers. We'll focus on the people who are making the big money. And that's why Durham Constabulary is the best in the country. The chief said once he's got his foot on the throat of the organised crime groups. He's keeping his foot firmly there, and I'm very glad about that. But as we dismantle one organised crime group, there's another one ready to come and take its place. And what you do find is that the levels of violence and organisation tends to increase incrementally as we go forward. So we've really got to break this cycle if we're going to do something significant. So it's interesting when you look at the new bill around psychoactive substances. I was reading some stuff about that. Possession is not an offence. Well, great. Let's get the principle of decriminalisation out there in the open for us all to sign up to. We then look at what they say around what police officers should consider when they come across someone with a potential psychoactive substance in their pocket. They should take into account the circumstances of the individual, have they committed previous offences, take into account what would be the cost of prosecution and cost of imprisonment, and is there a different way forward? Actually, that sounds very similar to some of the stuff we're trying to do here in Durham. We're not focusing on the user, and we've implemented a scheme called Checkpoint. And this is about diverting individuals who commit low-level crime away from the criminal justice system. So if someone's arrested for a low-level crime and we get an admission, the deal is this. You sign up to a contract with Durham Constabulary to work with us for 4 months. First part is you don't commit any further offences. That's a bit of a no-brainer, but that's what we say. Second, if there is a physical victim to the offence that you've committed, and that victim wants to engage in a restorative approach, then you will agree to engage in that restorative approach. The third element is to then say to the individual, right, what are your personal circumstances? And we'll look at the whole range of critical paths. Is it drugs that's causing you to commit offences? Is it alcohol? Is it domestic situation, financial situation? And we will deploy someone whom we call a navigator to work with that individual to see that they get the necessary support, the necessary services that they require, and we'll support them, whether it's a drug or alcohol addiction, back into recovery. That seems to me to be a far more sensible way than arrest, prosecute, imprison, come back out, arrest, prosecute, imprison. We must break the cycle, and that's what we are seeking to do. We do all sorts of other things as well. People talk about national procurement as a way forward for policing. Well, we've bought 100 GPS tags. I don't know where the chief got them from. I'm not asking him. We've got them for 100 quid each. National procurement, it cost us thousands. But we've got 100 of these tags, and we're saying to an individual, would it help if you wore a tag voluntarily? So when your mates call round to say you're coming out tonight, they can say no. And that's helped to reduce offending. It's helped to get individuals back onto the straight and narrow. And that is the way that we intend to take things forward within Durham Constabulary. We're having the whole thing evaluated by Cambridge University because it goes back to what others have said about evidence-based. Let's get the evidence. Let's get the academic rigour behind what it is we're seeking to do. And we just recently started a randomised controlled trial within Durham Constabulary, and the university will report back. But if we look at the referrals that we've had so far, we've had over 500 referrals through the Checkpoint scheme. Around half of those individuals, and even I can work out that's about 250, have successfully completed the programme. And only 2.6% of those individuals have failed the programme by reoffending. That is a far better outcome than we get from sending people to prison and releasing them. Thank you very much.
To our Global Leap Executive Director again, which is Mr. Neil Frank.
Again, thank you for this opportunity. As stated before, it is quite an impressive venue. And I've had the opportunity to speak in many venues around the world, and this is definitely number one in the Parliament, and I believe it will remain there probably forever. In my opening, I referenced comparing prohibition drug policy to slavery. And in the 1920s, it was the United Kingdom that began leading us away from slavery, the abolishment of slavery. And I, for one, am very grateful to that. When it was abolished in the United States, it was replaced with the 13th Amendment to our Constitution, which still provided a way for slavery. Because if you were being punished for a crime, involuntary servitude was okay. The 13th Amendment
prohibits involuntary servitude unless being punished for a crime. And of course, a crime is anything that we choose it to be. All we have to do is pass the appropriate legislation. We began in the United States after slavery with Jim Crow laws, such as vagrancy, to incarcerate people. And most of those people were freed slaves. So we could incarcerate you just for not having a home to go to. After the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we moved on to the war on drugs. And I believe our wonderful friend Richard Nixon was referenced earlier during our time here. In the 1970s, we had about 500,000 people incarcerated in the United States. And today that number is around 2.3 million. 2.3 million. And we can owe most of that, obviously, to the failed war on drugs, the prohibition of drugs. Now, even though blacks and whites use and sell drugs at relatively the same rate, 80% of drug crime felons in federal prison in the United States are black. 80%. And blacks are only 13% of the US population. There's a big problem with that. Let's talk about the United Kingdom. According to the Ministry of Justice, 2010 data shows the following for the United Kingdom. While blacks constitute only roughly 2.7% of the population 10 years of age and older, they are 13.7% of the prison population. Whites are around 88.6% of that population, yet make up only 72% of that prison population. And here's something very interesting. Just like in the United States, drug prohibition policy is the foundation for racial profiling today. And I say today, because it changes as you go through time. All of the people searched in the United Kingdom under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, 14.6% are black, and 67.2% are white. For both blacks and Asians, the rate of searches is higher than the arrest and incarceration rates. And for whites, the search rate is lower than both arrest and incarceration rates. There's something to that disparity there, that difference. This translates to higher rates of police-citizen negative contact for blacks and Asians here in the UK. The higher arrest and incarceration rates lead to fewer employment opportunities, therefore lower economic achievement overall. Quality of life deprivation due to economic disparity resulting from drug prohibition policies. So the disenfranchisement of certain communities and the deprivation of the ability to thrive in life. I'm from Baltimore in the United States. And I know that some of you here, I was speaking earlier with Mike Barton about the HBO series The Wire. Have any of you seen that? Just a quick show of hands. Very popular show, isn't it? Or used to be. It is very, very true to life. Very, very true to life. I can speak to you about some of the characters that are depicted in that series, in that show. I know them. I knew them. How these drug policies cause the problems that we have within community is frightening. As we, the police, go about our business of enforcing these policies, wanting to stop and search just about anyone who we believe may be holding drugs or possessing drugs or using drugs or selling drugs, and before long, in certain communities, everybody fits that appearance. The United Kingdom has an opportunity to lead us once again, especially with this organization. These criminal justice professionals, being on the front lines of this, being able to witness just how problematic and devastating this policy is the one group that if we really got our act together, when I say that, I don't mean our organization, I mean the entire criminal justice profession around the globe, we could end this almost overnight. The United Kingdom has an opportunity with LEAP UK to lead us once again out of slavery. In a couple of months, we have the United Nations General Assembly special session in New York City. The drug treaties that we have in the United Nations need to be greatly changed and altered, abolished from my perspective, but I don't think that's possible. We can make one hell of a statement if we show up there in force. So this organization, LEAP, needs all of you. LEAP UK needs all of you. And again, like I said before, I think the United Kingdom can truly be that instrument that takes us forward from here. Thank you.
Dr. Michael Shiner in the audience, who is from Stopwatch, which is an organisation designed to keep tabs on what's going on with stop and search powers.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here and to support LEAP because I think this is an area which is long overdue for reform for many of the reasons that people have talked about. I think drug policy and drug policing in particular is a net source of harm. That is to say, it does more harm than good. For lots of reasons that have been talked about. The policing of drug markets increases the risk environment, it increases violent interactions between people in drug supply networks, but also what I'd like to talk about is, I think one of the great harms and one of the great injustices of drug policing is the disproportionate impact on already vulnerable communities. So some work that I did with colleagues at Release showed how it really is drugs which is driving disproportionality in relation to black and minority ethnic communities for stop and search. And that has incredibly important knock-on effects because it means criminal records are unfairly distributed, it means contact with courts are unfairly distributed, and we're in a situation where members of black communities, particularly young black men, are more likely to have criminal records for drug offences, are more likely to be taken to court for drug offences, not because they're more likely to take drugs, because they're not, but because they're more likely to be stopped and searched by the police or to come in contact with the police. Now, I'm not here to talk on behalf of communities or to give voice to impacted communities because, of course, they have a voice of their own. And if you look at the Stopwatch website, it's one of the things that we do is that we try to create forums in which impacted communities can speak to the issue. But I did just want to share one piece of feedback that we had with my colleagues. Neve and Natasha went out and did some outreach work with young people for a project called Why Stop. And it involved going to youth clubs, and they came back and they said that they talked to one, I think it was 10-year-old, a young black boy, 10 years old. And he said he hated the police. And when he was asked why, he said he didn't know. It was just in his blood. And let's just think about that for a moment. Let's think about the implications of that, not only for that young person's relationship with the police, but for their relationship with the state as a whole, as to whether the state is something that they trust. So I think the case for reform is absolutely clear. And I'd just like to say a little bit about why I'm really excited about LEAP and why I think LEAP has such an important role to play. The case for reform is clear. How we get there is much less so. I think in the UK and in many other countries, if we're looking at reform, we're probably looking at piecemeal reform. We're not looking at prohibition being swept away overnight. We're looking at piecemeal reform, and the police can make or break that reform. The police can make that reform succeed, or they can make it fail. I'm an academic, I do quite a lot of research. One of the things which I've become a specialist in is reform failure, particularly failure in relation to trying to reform the police. And I think one of the great barriers to reform of the police is what I would call the conscious and unconscious mind of the police. The police, like many organisations, don't like to change. They particularly don't like being told how to change by people who aren't police. And this is really why I think LEAP is such an important voice. That LEAP can not only talk the language, not only has an intrinsic understanding of policing, not only can talk with credibility and authenticity, but is much less susceptible to the kinds of accusations that people like me face when we're told we're anti-police, we're ivory tower, we don't know what we're talking about. One of the pieces of work that I do with colleagues at the Open Society Foundation is to really work with police to promote change within police organisations. And the value of having progressive police officers to make the case for reform, I think is a hugely important and valuable way in which we get inside that unconscious resistance and that knee-jerk defensiveness and defiance, which will often accompany any move to reform. So I think LEAP is important not only because it provides cover for politicians, that I think it actually makes it much easier for politicians to start talking about reform, but also because LEAP can work with police organisations and progressive police, and I'm really pleased to hear about what's happening in Durham. It sounds awesome work, and to really work with progressive police officers to show what reform can do and how it can lead to a much more successful police interaction with communities. Very much.
Move straight along to Diane Goldstein, who retired as a Lieutenant Commander and is a LEAP UK board member.
Thank you. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights exist to define and promote our human potential while securing the right to life, liberty, and security. In my many roles as a law enforcement professional, a mom, a wife, a grandmother, I can say unequivocally that there is no other policy like our drug laws and treaties that have contributed to destroying our children and our families. Let me be clear that it is commendable and appropriate for government to protect us and our children in particular. Yet in our zeal to do so, we have seen significant damage done to families through our drug laws that replace common sense with zero tolerance, which in turn fosters injustice and results in death, disease, and addiction. Our policies often do more damage to our children and our families under the guise of protecting them than we would if we simply applied public health strategies that would help to minimize drug misuse in all our communities. For me, this fight for social justice is deeply personal, having witnessed the death and criminalization of my brother by our drug war. His death was a direct result of the stigma associated by those suffering not just from addiction, but from our society's moral judgment. I want to say and congratulate LEAP UK and the many coalition partners I see out here in the audience. But I also want to acknowledge the courage of the families like mine who share their individual stories of loss and pain. It is those stories that will help to end what can only be described as America's greatest political failure. I will end by sharing a quote I used at my brother's funeral to remind us of the cost to our families that can never be quantified. Washington Irving once stated, "There is sacredness in tears. They are not a mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love." And I share my tears with everyone here in the United Kingdom who has suffered as a part of America's drug war, which has driven the policies here and elsewhere across the countries. Thank you.
So you can see we've got to the point where we're discussing the cost of families. We've gone through the conception and now we're dealing with the literal definition of what's going on at street level with the war on drugs. Peter has come all the way from Belgium, and we purposely haven't mentioned your last name because I tried to get a pronunciation. My Ashby English can't cover it, so Peter.
Thank you. I'm really impressed by all the speakers. I'm not a native speaker, so I probably missed all the clues, but the clues I didn't miss made really sense to me. For your benefit, I'm just going to read my text. Then you at least can understand a bit of it. 9 years ago, my brother, Tom, died from an overdose. After several months of drug therapy, he got his first weekend leave. He would go sailing with 2 friends, at least that's what he and his friends told the staff. But it turned out they had other plans. He was found in Bergen-op-Zoom, a Dutch town near the border with Belgium. He overdosed on a combination of pills, hard liquor, cocaine and heroin. Meanwhile, as a police officer responsible for public order maintenance at the local soccer game in Antwerp, I was trying to get some Dutch hooligans out of Antwerp. While my brother was committing suicide, I used the term suicide on purpose because I firmly believe he was too tired to continue fighting his addiction. So while my brother was committing suicide, I was performing my public service duty in Antwerp. Indeed, I always took my job very seriously, and I still do. And maybe I should have taken the fate of my brother more seriously while I was still alive. Being a policeman didn't make things easier. 9 years after he died, I wrote our story. The book has been published in September last year. I quote a journalist, because it's less pretentious if I quote a journalist. In Brothers We Were, that's a literary translation of the title, Police Officer Peter Muishond, that's my name pronounced properly, Peter Muishond tells, through journalist Hans Zinzen's pen, the story of his brother who died from an overdose. Tom a junk and Peter a chief superintendent. But above all, brothers. And with every page you turn, the unpronounced conclusion presents itself unequivocally: our drug policy has to change. Tom could have been alive, unquote. I have tried to describe my moral conflicts and the continuous clash between what I was expected to do as a police officer and my feelings towards my brother. I thought that publishing this book would bring some ease of mind, but I was wrong. I support LEAP because I am convinced that Belgium's drugs policy is a policy of hypocrisy based on one-liners and sadly lacking in courage. I can speak out because I'm not in Belgium. Our actual political leaders strongly believe in the war on drugs, albeit with a twist. While police is doing severe drug checks at the entrance of rock concerts, youngsters can drink their guts out at the surrounding drunk stalls. So let's go a bit further into this rather strange way of looking at risk of addiction. Alcohol, and more specifically our numerous beers, have become part of our national culture and heritage, and gambling is promoted on national television. Our national soccer competition is named after a well-known beer. As a policeman, I have had to deal with more alcohol-related problems than with problems related to cannabis, for instance. Not only in traffic, but in situations of public order, alcohol is frequently involved when it comes to accidents, fighting or public nuisance. But it is natural culture. Let's chase some vulnerable junks instead. Drug abuse is a complex matter. No argument there. And just because it is a very complex matter, it requires an evidence-based approach. It requires leadership that goes beyond easy one-liners, and maybe policemen who deal with the consequences of this drug policy every day should speak up and voice their opinion. Addiction might be considered as a disease or a mental disorder. If so, a judicial reaction is a rather strange way of dealing with mental disorder. If I were in that situation, I would prefer help instead of a penalty. Prevention and health care should be the key words here, not repression. Police and other law enforcement officials might influence the debate. After all, we belong to a worldwide network and we all are some kind of family too. But therefore we need to face police culture, which is rather conventional culture and a hard nut to crack. Because let's face it, the majority of police still believes in the war on drugs. It's easy work after all. I thank you for inviting me today. I'm sure we will have the opportunity to expand on this topic later tonight at the unofficial event.
And Peter is Serbian Deputy Police Chief, as you can hear, very personal tale. And we turn to Rose Humphreys, who's part of Anyone's Child, which we've transformed, which we can't thank enough, along with Release and IDPC. We can't thank enough for the support today. Rose Humphreys, representing Anyone's Child.
Thank you.
My story is of two of my sons. As young teenagers, they began dabbling with drugs, and we didn't suspect. Cannabis, amphetamines, and magic mushrooms were readily available, despite their supply being against the law. Jake's and Roland's friends were doing these drugs too, even though using them was against the law. But when most of their friends did not go on to become heroin addicts, my boys did. It could happen to anyone's child, regardless of their upbringing. Roland, my youngest, died 12 years ago, age 23, while on a long methadone program waiting list. He used heroin at a friend's house. The people there delayed calling 999. We wonder if they delayed from fear of trouble with the police. Roland's death didn't deter Jake from drug use. Jake, away at university when it happened, coped with his distress by using drugs. But eventually, Jake became free of drugs for almost 7 years. Then, in 2013, he relapsed for a short time. In 2014, just before completing a master's degree, he relapsed again. We found out he was ashamed and promised to stop. His future was bright, but a few days later, he died alone from heroin overdose. He was 37. If only he could have got heroin from somewhere where it was prescribed, along with counselling, instead of from a street dealer. When my grandchildren are older, I prefer them not to use drugs. But if they do, I want it to be without going to risky environments, without risking a criminal record or worse, without their families feeling fear and shame, and with truthful drugs education, and by choosing safely produced and labelled products from regulated outlets. That's why I joined Anyone's Child. The families in our group know the misery caused by our drug laws. I hope we can influence policy to prevent other parents having to hear the worst news any parent can hear. The thing that most parents don't even want to think about. The tears and the grief of having to arrange their child's funeral. That's why I want legal regulation of drugs.
Unfortunately, Neil Woods has got to. Neil Woods is chairman of LEAP UK and has dealt with the very issues that Rose just mentioned. Neil, undercover detective.
Hello. That's the second time I've followed speaking someone from Anyone's Child, and it is quite difficult. Thank you very much, Rose, for bringing that to our attention. At the moment in the UK, we have record drug deaths each year. We have 50 people dying a week, but you hear lots of statistics, and you can't think in terms of the numbers, because when you hear someone like Rose speak, that's 50 grieving families, mothers, daughters, whoever, 50 groups of grieving people every week. When my involvement in conventional policing, as an accredited drug expert and a detective, I had a great deal to do with investigating drug deaths. And I can say with certainty that each one of those drug deaths could have been prevented in a regulated system. Now, in my work, working undercover, which I did over the space of about 14 years, for the work that I did, I tried to infiltrate organised crime groups from the lower end up. And over that time, many times I went to Crown Court to give evidence, and I would have to be smuggled in. I would give evidence behind a screen with a pseudonym to protect my identity. In fact, even when I travelled around the country working undercover, even the police officers that I worked with weren't allowed to know my real identity. Because such is the power of corruption from the money involved in drugs, the gangsters have spies in the ranks of the police as well. And I have encountered that firsthand. So the anonymity is quite a sensible thing. I've had more death threats than I can remember. But in becoming part of LEAP and becoming part of public life, this is my real name. I have given up that anonymity. And some people have suggested to me this is a bit crazy. You know, I've had these death threats, and it's not necessarily a sensible thing to do. So I'll try and explain why. I had all sorts of dangerous experiences working undercover, being threatened with samurai swords or cars or whatever other things, various dangerous experiences. But they are not the things that stay in my mind. The things that stay in my mind are the people who are trampled on by our drug laws, who are trampled on by prohibition. People like Gary in Nottingham, who I had manipulated over the space of about 3 months for the purposes of catching the gangsters I was after. And you have to bear in mind that there are many organised crime groups, many gangsters in this country, that the only way they will ever get caught is by the kind of undercover work that I did, the kind of manipulation that I had to do. So Gary in Nottingham, when he was arrested, was suicidal. He had to be watched in the cells because he was suicidal. And this is not because of the danger that I put him in. I had put him in danger because I manipulated him and showed him in front of the gangsters. I had put him in danger. It's not because he was scared of going to prison. He did go to prison for 3 years. It was because he thought I was his only friend in the world. Because as a result of that manipulation, I was showing him the compassion and the care that we all should have been doing anyway. But the only time he got that compassion and care was so that he could be manipulated for prosecuting our insane drug laws. And that's the only way he got the compassion. So, yeah, he was suicidal. Or the couple in Northampton, who I also manipulated in similar terms. The only support structure they had was each other in their problematic drug use. And as a result of their interaction with the law, our drug laws, they were separated by a 3-year prison sentence, because obviously they couldn't go to prison together. And so this is why I spoke out, and I am very proud to be part of this growing movement, this global movement. And I do hope that in the coming months that many of us will continue to be vocal, and we will continue to explain about the costs and corruption of the war on drugs. And I do hope that lots of people will listen. And please, when law enforcement figures say things like this, please ask us why. Thank you.
So we've got 5 minutes before we've got to leave the room, and there's still voices in the audience that we really want to hear. And if we don't hear them today, please come to the Waterstones event in the evening at 7 o'clock at Tottenham Court Road, where we're going to have a lot more interactivity. But can we have Clark and Faye, Tom Lloyd and Katie Anderson, can you stand up and please kind of condense it down into that 5 minutes we've got before we head out the room, just the supporting voices. We've got Faye and Clark, who are medicinal cannabis users. We've got Katie Anderson from Student Sensible Drug Policy, that focus on what this is doing to the arguably one of the most vulnerable groups, of the younger people. We've got Tom Lloyd, former Chief Constable Cambridge.
Hello, my name is Clark and I am an MS patient. I find that medical cannabis helps me more than any other prescription medication. So I don't think that I should be criminalised for that fact. I save the government, or save the NHS £30,000 every year. My story is the same as so many people in this country, so many sick people who are just struggling to have a better quality of life, who find that cannabis helps them more than anything else and then are criminalised for it. We have founded the United Patients Alliance to fight for those people's rights, and I want to thank Jason personally because I really appreciate being here. As everyone else has said, to say something in this room is a privilege, so thank you very much, Jason.
My name's Faye Jones. I'm also a medical cannabis patient. I just want to talk a little bit about how law enforcement affects me as a person who takes cannabis to have the best possible quality of life that's available to me. The United Patients Alliance represents lots of patients who take cannabis for a whole huge range of different symptoms and conditions, despite its current status as a prohibited substance which has no medicinal value according to our current government. As a medical cannabis patient myself, I not only have to fear that the law enforcement could come to my house, they could arrest me, they could take away my freedom, give me a fine, they could take away the two things that I rely on most to have a normal life, which is my medicine, cannabis, and my driving licence. On top of that, I'm also left vulnerable as a victim of crime because I don't feel that I can call on the assistance of law enforcement if a crime is committed against me, whatever it is. I could be burgled, it could be a violent crime. I wouldn't call the police because I don't feel that it would be safe to myself. That is obviously bad not only for innocent patients, it's bad for the police and the criminal justice system who have to operate within our community. And it's good for dealers and organised criminals because I have no choice but to give them nearly all of my expendable income if I want to keep living my life pain-free. So with that in mind, it's really great to hear a loud voice for change coming from the very organisations that as a medical cannabis consumer, I have learned to fear. And so I'd like to thank everyone at LEAP for taking a stand for what's right, not just for myself, but for all consumers of all substances that are illicit.
We're literally pushing our luck now because our room has got 1 more minute. So can we do 30 seconds from Tom and Katie, if that's remotely, just a summary if that's possible. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So I just really want to talk very, very quickly about how prohibitionist policy affects young people. And one of the sort of things I wanted to talk about is how many universities have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to drug use. And so this means, if in particular from Newcastle University, students, if found with any amount of illegal drugs, are evicted from university accommodation. So no questions asked, you're just evicted, no further support is given. I just wanted to read a couple of quotes sort of from people who've been affected by this policy. The month after we were caught smoking weed was probably one of the most stressful of my entire life. And as a result, I suffered from anxiety for pretty much the whole year, which has only just subsided now. And another student says, I think that zero tolerance had no impact whatsoever on stemming drug taking in halls. It builds a hostile environment between university security and students. The policy made security unapproachable to me and only served to seriously impact my work and cause a lot of stress in my housing situation. Attempting to make people homeless over cannabis is unjust and wrong, whatever your personal feelings on the matter are. And yeah, I just want to say thank you for Jason and Sleep UK, and we fully support what they're doing.
Tom is a powerhouse, so if you can do it.
Jason, I won't have time to thank you because I've only got 30 seconds. Just take it as read. Some years ago, I studied philosophy, and I think it was actually quite helpful because my tutors insisted that I couldn't just take the given view, but I had to challenge it. I had to look at all sides of the argument. And I would urge all police officers and all involved in law enforcement, in fact every single human being on this planet, to think like a philosopher. Let's think about, as a cop, you want to help people and you want to catch criminals. So the given wisdom is you'll help somebody by arresting them and throwing them in prison for taking drugs. If you actually start looking at the opposite, say your child was arrested in possession of drugs, what would you want? Conviction? A stain on their character for life? Or would you want them to get some treatment and support? And similarly, if you think about catching criminals, let's just think. There's a young boy or a young girl sexually abused as a child. The only thing they can do to take away the pain is take a drug. That drug happens to be illegal to possess. So what do as police officers? We arrest them. Are they really criminals? That, to me, is at the core of the fact that this is not a war on drugs, it's a war on people. And it's the people who are vulnerable and actually in need of support rather than punishment that the police service should be operating under a regime, not of prohibition, but of legal regulation. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it, we conclude. And because we're having to do so much outreach, because we know the voices need to travel to the chambers over there, if we can just do a gimmick, if we can just do a publicity stunt, if you agree with our banner of law enforcement, stand with communities to drug law reform, can you please stand? Can you please show your support for it? I think that's pretty unanimous. Thank you so much for coming. Join us at Waterstones at Tottenham Court Road 7 if you can. Thank you.